What if I told you that the most destructive form of fishing in the entire world is actually not economically justifiable? Good morning. I'm Ryan Saathoff. I'm going to be talking about just that issue, specifically bottom trawling. What is trawling, you ask? Good question. Trawling is actually just a form of fishing that involves either one or two 4,000 horsepower boat dragging a weighted net along the bottom of the ocean floor. There are two forms of bottom trawling. There's both benthic and demersal. Demersal is just above the seafloor, but we're going to be looking at benthic today, which is actually on the seafloor. This is used to catch varieties of different fish. Up in the Atlantic, you'll be looking at different varieties of rockfish, such as sole and flounder and halibut. But down in more tropical waters, looking at scallops, you're looking at shrimp, and this will just change on the climate. As you can imagine, dragging a weighted net along the bottom of the seafloor is highly destructive. So, looking below the surface, ecosystem destruction is a huge problem when it comes to bottom trawling. About 50% of the world's continental shelf area is lost annually to bottom trawling. This accounts for about 150 times what is lost to deforestation yearly. Just to kind of show you what this looks like in real time, this is before and after scallop dredging, 2 days after each other. And what also makes it even more impactful is the fact that these are very, especially in the deep sea settings, when you're looking at high sea bottom trawling, or HSBT, what you see is that because the deep sea fishing is at about 7,000 feet below the surface, these ecosystems are very cold, they're not very productive, and they're not very resilient. And in fact, many of the fish that live in these areas take 10 to 40 years to mature, which is pretty ridiculous. So they have to constantly be moving the dredge sites. And so these aren't rebounding, and you're constantly spreading out where you're trawling to begin with. More so, bycatch is a huge issue when it comes to trawling. Bycatch is the additional fish that is caught in the nets whenever you bring it forth. This varies based on what you're fishing. If you're up in the Atlantic and doing flatfish, you're probably going to have about a 40% bycatch. But when it comes to shrimp trawling, you're looking close to 90% sometimes, because the netting is so fine, and so you're catching all sorts of things. And this includes anything from dolphins and sea turtles to the entire coral reefs you lose to this process. It's just incredibly intensive. But the problems don't just lie below the surface. There's also a bunch of problems above the surface. And so looking above the waves, one thing that we really see is direct impacts to local economies, specifically in the developing world. For instance, local fisheries in Indonesia have seen a 40% decrease in production since bottom trawling has expanded in that region. And then in terms of tourism, we've seen Belize lose incredible amounts of money to tourism, as bottom trawling has destroyed ecosystems that would have been great for marine tourism, such as scuba diving, snorkeling, boating, etc. And for instance, actually put a price tag on sea turtles. People typically pay $35 more to see a sea turtle, pay $55 for an intact coral reef. And so they've actually attached price tags to these tourist items and how much is being lost to bottom trawling. But I think the most interesting thing is actually the exorbitant amount of fuel consumption and GHG emissions that are associated with bottom trawling. In the instance of just fuel, there was actually a study done in Fish and Fisheries in 2015 that was a metadata survey that looked at 1,600 different scientific studies that were done looking at fuel consumption, ranging anything from freshwater fishing and the Great Lakes all the way to Antarctic fishing. It analyzed basically all records of fishing across the globe, and what it found is that trawling is the most intensive fuel. It requires the most diesel per metric ton of fish at 2,728 liters of diesel fuel for every metric ton. What we're seeing annually there's actually mixed records of what we're actually bringing forth from trawling annually. In 2005, they found that about between 175,000 metric tons and 215,000 metric tons were used. Just to kind of show you how awful it is, I used the lowest estimate at 175,000 metric tons, and doing that I found that around almost half, 500 billion liters of diesel fuel is used annually for this. And then I turned to a study by a professor of thermofluids at Exeter University in the UK, and he found that it takes for every 1 liter of diesel fuel you'll burn, you'll actually emit about 2.68 kilograms of CO2. And so then whenever you attach that to the diesel that's being used in this process, you're looking at 1,325,000,000,000 kilograms of CO2 annually. which is pretty excessive, I would say. And so I also have to ask, like, is this worth the impact? Like, actually, you know, and often sometimes with industries, if economic benefits are there, like, why not? But what you're seeing here is that this industry only accounts for about 300 to 400 million annually, which I think we'd all like to have that in our bank account right now, but in truth, that accounts for about 0.5% of the fishing industry, of saltwater fishing, which is about 75 billion. And in fact, in this study, they actually compared Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, because it made that amount of money that year. So I thought that was a pretty like fun little statistic that compared it. So just think about like how like an average like Hollywood blockbuster makes as much money as this entirely destructive fishing process. So I know I'm supposed to talk about this as science, but as a policy major, I have to talk about solutions. One thing that I will say is that we do need more and newer data for to make more conclusive evidence, more conclusive results. So what we have here is that most of the study that was done by Oceana in about the mid-2000s, and I will admit that there actually has not been much international law done in that time, so we haven't seen a bunch of like different fishery laws been taking place in the past 10 years. So I'm sure the studies are pretty accurate. However, there's a pretty like large variability, as I mentioned, in how much we bring up, how much we're burning, especially like in bycatch we're very uncertain. And because lots of this is happening in international waters where international law is like not very strong, we're not actually certain of how much bycatch is being thrown back into the ocean. And so some of these impacts are probably actually lowballing it, which if you think about what we already seen, it's pretty egregious. Therefore, what I would say right now is that we need a moratorium on this. There's just no reason that we should be destroying this much ecosystems, emitting this much pollution, and burning this much fuel for such low economic benefits. Thank you. Any questions?
Are there any particular species that are fished for this way so people could know that this is a trawl?
I know, actually that's one thing I found most interesting is that most people are also about the health benefits of eating wild-caught fish. But if you're eating wild-caught flounder, you're probably actually doing worse things for the environment than if you were to eat like farm-raised tilapia. And that's even like saying if you're eating farm-raised tilapia from Indochina that's being imported. Like you could eat like flounder from the like Alaskan coast, and that would actually be more impactful on the environment than it would be to have some sort of like farm-raised fish from Thailand come into you. So it's pretty awful. But specifically, you're looking at mostly like flatfishes or rockfishes or sole or flounder. They all actually have like the same name, but they keep on just like changing around for reasons I don't fully understand. I'm sure there's like good like biological reasons that they do it. Yeah, no, for sure. Some of these fish that they catch can actually like stay almost 200 years old, and they take like as mentioned like some of them take 10 to 40 years to mature. And then one thing I forgot to mention is actually another reason that local fisheries are so hurt is that bottom trawling actually collects a lot of infants, and it kills them all. Like almost 100% of everything that's in bycatch is killed. So people actually call it kill catch, but I found that a little dark and morbid, so I left it out. Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you so much.